Welcome to So You Want to Do a Systematic Review, one of our Levy Library 30-minute Zoom sessions. My name is Samantha Walsh. I'm a librarian at the Levy Library, and I very often meet with groups to participate as an author on systematic reviews and or kind of consult on their systematic review process. So really excited to kind of talk about that with you guys today. I do have a colleague here, Carrie Levinson, who will be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in there at any point, and any that she doesn't get to, I can answer at the end, or we can kind of also just discuss at the end. So today we are going to kind of talk about what the definition of a systematic review is. We'll touch on maybe some other review types that often might get confused with systematic reviews. We'll talk about the methodology. We'll talk about kind of like what you need, what you should be starting with to conduct a systematic review. We'll talk about specific standards and guidelines that you'll hear about very often in the systematic review space. And we'll talk about the support that's available to you through the Levy Library. So I am going to be trying to use this example today. It's not, it's by no means necessary that you pull it up right now, but I do have links provided here, and it might be kind of interesting or useful for you to maybe read this paper after the session, kind of after discussing systematic reviews, to kind of take like a critical eye to one. But this is what we'll be using for our examples. And I will share my slides after so that you can get to this. So, defining systematic reviews. So this is the Cochrane definition. So in a little bit, we will kind of talk about what Cochrane is. But Cochrane defines, in their handbook, defines a systematic review as an attempt to collate all empirical evidence that fits pre-specified eligibility criteria in order to answer a specific research question, using explicit systematic methods that are selected with a view to minimize bias. So kind of that's something we're always thinking about with a systematic review, where we might be conducting a literature review and we don't have these kind of like really specific methods that we're adhering to. A big difference with systematic reviews is the reason that we're following all of these guidelines and methods is because we want our readers to feel really confident that we did everything we could to minimize bias, the same way you would if you were conducting a study, on human subjects or otherwise. You would do everything you could to minimize bias and, of course, harm to your subjects as well. Thus providing more reliable findings from which conclusions can be drawn and decisions made. And so I think it's important to point out, because I think it is often confused between a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is often kind of like the next step after a systematic review. So once you have kind of gone through and systematically located and systematically brought together all of your evidence on a specific question, studies addressing your specific question, a meta-analysis, which is a quantitative statistical analysis of independent studies, might be conducted, but it might not be. And so we might confuse the two, but it's important to remember that you can have a systematic review without a meta-analysis, but you can also have a combination of the two. You could also have a meta-analysis without a systematic review, which would be, a meta-analysis of a few studies where you didn't go through systematic methods to locate those studies. But that is, I think, a bit rarer. And I like to put this evidence pyramid here when we talk about the definition of systematic reviews, because if we're familiar with the evidence pyramid, we know that we almost always put systematic reviews and meta-analyses at the top. And while I think that that is, important, and it kind of exemplifies the fact that systematic reviews and meta-analyses are kind of the bringing together and the synthesis of all of these studies, it's important to remember that just like an up-to-date entry, or maybe even like a textbook chapter, a systematic review is is a summary of the evidence, is someone else's, an author's, or maybe your own summary of the evidence, as opposed to the evidence itself, the studies. So I think it's important to remember that while we do put it on the top, there is kind of this fundamental difference between like filtered and unfiltered information. So, before we continue talking about systematic reviews, I think it's important to kind of note some other types of reviews. And so, when defining systematic reviews, I think it's kind of easiest to explain what a systematic review is by explaining how it is not a literature review. So a literature review might be a situation where you want to provide your reader kind of maybe a broad overview of a certain topic, maybe because that's just kind of necessary for, the field or the journal at the time, or maybe because you're introducing your own research. But this is typically a fairly subjective review where you are searching, you're including evidence that might range from guidelines to, some older papers to some newer papers. You're not specifically including studies that are all addressing the same question. Whereas a systematic review is a review where you are asking yourself, what is the specific question that I have, and what types of studies do I need to answer it? And that is what you are including. So for me, that's, not just for me, for everyone, that's really the big difference between a narrative or literature review and a systematic review. It's really kind of your end goal. So in a literature review, your reader will end up with kind of like this broad overview, an introduction to this topic. They might kind of understand where the research is going in this area. Whereas with a systematic review, we're thinking, okay, there are a good amount of studies addressing this question. Maybe it's about the kind of like intervention, a specific intervention, and I want to bring those studies together to potentially have a higher level of evidence. Another thing that we kind of maybe get confused with is a scoping review. So I think scoping reviews are really, really useful and interesting. And a lot of the time they're more useful when studies or literature in a certain area is more in the preliminary phase or more kind of like varied in type. So a scoping review, instead of attempting to find studies that are all addressing like the same question or, the same intervention, a scoping review is an attempt to find studies that are all that kind of describe where the research is in a certain area. So you might conduct a scoping review where you wonder, okay, what are the kind of common family-based interventions for suicidal individuals? They're not, I'm not looking at the efficacy of one family-based intervention. I want to see kind of all over the place, what are the kind of different ways that families are being used to, help these individuals. And I'm going to lay that out for my readers in my review. However, a lot of the steps in a scoping review are the same as a systematic review when it comes to really systematically searching the literature. Finally, a rapid review. This is a very kind of timely example. That's why I put it on here, because there are many other review types, but a rapid review is typically a situation where you would just love to create a systematic review, but you simply don't have the time. Because as we'll learn, a systematic review does have many steps, and it can take, as long as a year, maybe even longer. And so this is a situation where you kind of need your evidence sooner. I'm sure situations like that can all come to our minds right now. And so you potentially kind of maybe cut back on certain aspects of the systematic review protocol, making it less rigorous, but for the purpose of getting your evidence synthesis out there sooner. So we are going to play a little game that I will kind of just moderate. Oh, thank you, Carrie, for sharing that link. So if everyone or if a few people want to participate in the chat, looking at these titles, and of course they could all be argued a little bit, but looking at these titles, what do we think, what type of review do we think childhood obesity, current and novel approaches would be? Systematic, narrative, or scoping? Okay, I'm going to say that one is, yes, I agree. That one is narrative. I guess you could make the argument that you could make a scoping review over that, but I would actually want it to be maybe even a little bit more specific in that case. So what about this second one? Clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness of cysteine compared with varenicline for smoking cessation. So this sounds like a pretty specific study design, right? We're very, kind of specifically, yep, systematic review. We're specifically comparing two interventions for a very specific outcome. So I would call that a systematic review. Problems and solutions in delivering global surgery in the 21st century. So sounds super broad to me. So what type of review might this be? I'm going to say narrative. So this one, I really want participation with this one. Health personnel targeted education interventions on inpatient suicide prevention in general hospitals. So we're looking at we want to kind of find different types of educational interventions all potentially happening with, maybe the same population. Scoping, yes, I would call this a scoping review. And, it is because I found it on PubMed. It exists. Finally, incidence, prevalence, and outcomes of rheumatic heart disease in South Africa. It's very broad, right? Narrative, and mindfulness meditation as an intervention for binge eating, emotional eating, and weight loss. So we do have for this one, we do have a few outcomes, but we do have kind of one intervention. And so I could say, okay, I'm looking for, so, I'll give it away. I would say this could also be a systematic review, but when I would be designing my systematic review for this question, I'm thinking, okay, I'm looking for studies that are all using this intervention, but I have a few different outcomes that I might kind of accept from these studies. And so that kind of brings us to thinking about methodology, because what do I mean basically when I say we have a few different outcomes that we might accept? And so, to kind of start from the beginning, systematic review methodology begins with a question or topic. So, if we remember our end goal with a systematic review, where we are either qualitatively or quantitatively or both bringing together studies that are examining either the same intervention or the same new diagnostic method or something, bringing together these very similar similarly designed studies, all addressing the same intervention on hopefully a similar population. If we remember that end goal, it becomes a lot easier to define our question. So we might say, okay, I want to do a systematic review on the flu vaccine. But we need to step back and think, okay, what types of interventions are out there? Maybe I need to kind of think about if there is a specific dosage of the flu vaccine I'm interested in. Think about kind of where the evidence is and also where the gap in the literature might be, and that might happen from conducting preliminary searching. We might kind of notice, okay, this aspect that interests me really doesn't have many studies, but there are quite a few recent studies that are looking at, an intervention with this specific community and the flu vaccine. Or sorry, the flu vaccine would be the intervention. And so that could potentially be how I get there. And so we always want to kind of start with this two-pronged approach where we have an interest, but we're also making sure that the literature supports our interest. And then we want to draft a protocol. And so in our protocol, we want to have our systematic review question, and we want to have our inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the only way that you can have really solid inclusion and exclusion criteria is by, really carefully doing your preliminary searching. So that means thinking, okay, if I want to answer this question on the flu vaccine, what types of studies will I be able to include? And then I can look at, during my preliminary searching, I'm looking at what's out there and I'm asking myself, okay, what will I do if I see this during my screening process? Would this be a yes or a no? And so then I can start to say, okay, I know that I won't want to include studies that have patients under the age of 65. I know that I don't want to include studies that didn't have a control group, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of that should kind of come together from understanding what's out there. And as you draft your protocol, that's something that you want to be kind of doing as a team, because of course this is a team project. And so this is something that you should all be agreeing on and understanding. Then comes the comprehensive search. So I am planning a session on conducting a comprehensive search in the future. We're not going to talk about that much today, but we have lots of videos that we can help you with, and we meet with you guys one-on-one to help you with comprehensive searches. But really the point of a comprehensive search is you want to find everything that's out there on this topic. You don't want something not to be included in your systematic review because you didn't find it. You want to be able to kind of say no to it. And so the way to do that is to think about all of the terms that might be used and all of the places that these studies might be published, and search all of those places. But of course you don't want to have so many articles to go through. So you want to kind of strike this balance between searching searching the keywords that make sense and kind of cutting the ones that are giving you too much. And so it's very much a trial and error process. But the big difference about a search for a systematic review and a scoping review and a rapid review, the big difference between that search and the search that you might do for a literature review is you want to have one search. You want to have one search that you can publish in your manuscript and provide to your readers so that they can potentially reproduce what you did. Um, and so that's where, and then you're kind of running it on one day. So that's a big difference. You're not kind of going to, searching one day and then going back to PubMed and searching a little more. And so then you get to your study selection, where you have two independent reviewers that are screening the titles and abstracts of every article that is found in your search. So let's say you search 3 databases and deduplicated, you have 1,200 results. Each reviewer doesn't screen 600 results. Each reviewer screens 1,200 titles and abstracts, and they've agreed upon that inclusion-exclusion criteria. So they're blindly saying, or blindly to each other, they're saying yes and no to the titles and abstracts. And then, of course, you might have some disagreements, which could be resolved by having a discussion or having a third reviewer. And then you're going to do the same thing with everything that makes it through that round, screening the full text of everything that makes it through. And so usually it's a big, big difference. For example, if let's say you did have 1,200, of course, all of this is very topic dependent, but if you did have 1,200 titles and abstracts, you could have something like, I don't know, 60 full text. It should go way, way down. And then you want to conduct a quality appraisal on every article that you've decided to include. So let's say you go down from that 60 to 10 articles that you're actually going to include that meet your criteria. You're going to put them up against a quality appraisal tool where you kind of ask yourself, was this study conducted in a way that reduced bias? Do we want to include this study's evidence in our systematic review? And that is something that you'd want to discuss in your manuscript. And I have an example on the next slide. Finally, you get to the exciting part where you can actually extract the data, and the data should be pretty similar because you've done all this work at the beginning to kind of make sure that you're finding studies that are very similar. So each study that you find should be kind of reporting very similar variables that you can extract from your articles to then synthesize and hopefully tell your readers something that they might not have felt so confident hearing from the individual studies. So for some examples of how that might look in a manuscript, not to scare anyone, but this is an example of the search from that systematic review that I put up earlier. And so this is an extremely detailed search, but it's a very well conducted review. So basically what reviewers do, or what librarians typically do, is figure out what terms should be searched and combined to locate anything that might be of interest to the reviewers. And then what we do is we publish this flowchart that I will kind of explain. It comes from a guidelines called Prisma that I'll show you guys in a second, but I'm sure this is really, really familiar to you from systematic reviews. But basically, this describes that process where we began with almost 3,000 records. Deduplicated, we get down to 2,200, but then screening 2,200 titles and abstracts only got them 39 articles that they actually read the full text of. Because think about it, in these results, there's reviews, there's editorials, there's case reports, there's so many things that are not being included that you're just saying no, no, no to. And then after that full text screening is when you end up with the actual trials or studies that you're going to include. And then what they did, and what most systematic reviewers would do, would be putting each of their 7 studies up against this risk of bias tool, where which they actually don't, in their description of their risk of bias table, they don't say what it was that they used, but where they are explaining which of these kind of like study indicators they were able to find. So we can kind of, as we can have a clearer view of how we feel about the studies that were included in the systematic review. So all of this is, in the interest of transparency, so that when you are reading a systematic review, you're able to feel kind of more or less confident in the results. So I'm sure you're kind of asking, well, how am I, if I want to do a systematic review, how am I supposed to know that I'm supposed to do that I'm supposed to create this search? And so in addition to coming to us, there are a bunch of standards, guidelines, and tools for you to use. So the Cochrane collaboration includes the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews, which is useful but extremely dense. So there's a lot in there. So while I would recommend reading it, I would also recommend taking a look at Prisma. But sorry, to go back to Cochrane, another thing I would recommend doing with Cochrane is looking at their systematic reviews. We basically say that Cochrane creates the gold standard for systematic reviews. So they're a great place to go if you want some kind of like examples of very, very well conducted systematic reviews. However, Prisma is a document that provides reporting guidelines for systematic reviews. So as opposed to a guidebook, what you actually have with Prisma is a list of, I think it's like 27 points that you need to report to have conducted your systematic review according to Prisma, that you need to report in your manuscript. And so it makes it a lot simpler, because instead of this whole explanation, like this is what you need to do and this is what you need to do, it's just like, okay, you need to report how you conducted risk of bias. So then you're like, okay, I need to figure out how to conduct risk of bias. And so there is an expansion document associated with Prisma that explains all of that. So that is, for me, kind of like the most useful and most accessible way to kind of understand the whole methodology. And then a companion document to Prisma would be Moose, which is very, very similar guidelines that are slightly adapted for systematic reviews that are not looking at interventional studies, but that are looking more at observational studies. Finally, 2 other useful tools would be Grade, which is a document that can help you kind of understand the risk of bias section of a systematic review and how you might kind of want to approach the studies that you're going to include. And finally, Prospero, which is a place where people register their systematic reviews. So this is an example of the Prisma checklist. This is actually only the first page, but if you take a look, and you kind of read if you read a systematic reviews method section, you'll actually notice that they usually report all of these items. And so it's a great way to kind of know exactly what you should be reporting in your systematic review. So kind of to sum up what we've kind of discussed, because I think it's important to know what you should be what you should be doing when you're conducting a systematic review, but also what you should be thinking about when you're reading a systematic review. So some quality indicators when you are reading a systematic review would be seeing if they adhered to any guidelines, Prisma, Moose, Cochrane. There are some others, but those are the big ones. So kind of putting it out there that they did conduct their systematic review according to these guidelines, and clearly defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. So not just saying like, we did a systematic review, looking at the efficacy of the flu vaccine, but saying, we did a systematic review looking at the efficacy of the flu vaccine, and we chose to include only articles that, had 100 or more human subjects, that, had a control group, were RCTs, stuff like that. You want to see evidence of the search. So hopefully, if they did conduct their systematic review according to Prisma, they've actually published their search as an appendix or right within the text. And you want to see that they searched more than one database. You don't want to see that they just searched PubMed or searched PubMed in Google Scholar, but that they went to many databases, which helps to kind of retrieve everything that might be out there. Because just because something's not in a certain database, or maybe your search didn't pick it up in a certain database, doesn't mean that it's not part of the evidence base for a certain intervention. And finally, that they conducted quality appraisal or risk of bias using a validated tool. So this step, while it's not always as clearly displayed in the text as it was in our example with a table like that, it should always at least be noted that it was done. So what do you need to conduct a systematic review? So a clearly defined question and available studies. While you might want to conduct a systematic review on a certain, maybe emerging topic, it might not be possible. Sometimes there are questions we want to answer that there just aren't studies available for. And kind of with that, we want to make sure that there is a gap in the literature. Typically, if there are a lot of studies addressing a similar question, there might already be a systematic review. That doesn't mean you can't do one, but it might mean that you might need to kind of take a different angle or think about a different outcome for your systematic review. You need a motivated team. So very often a systematic review can take as long as a year, and even beyond that, there might be situations where it is, it is rejected and you need to kind of like fix some things and it goes beyond a year. You also need to kind of make sure you have enough time and that your team members have enough time. That the kind of beginning of a systematic review isn't so time consuming, especially when you're screening through the titles and abstracts. It's pretty quick, but when you get to that full text stage and your data synthesis stage, it does get much more time consuming for your team. So it's important to kind of think how much time you'll be putting into this even a few months down the road. And so finally, you should also come to us at the Levy Library. So our systematic review services are all kind of described on our systematic review guide, which I have. It's available here on our website, Systematic Review Support. And so the biggest thing we can help you guys with is creating your search. However, beyond that, we're very happy to help you kind of find your topic, see what's going on. We're happy to help you draft your research protocol, and with selecting a quality appraisal tool, everything available here. So depending on how much you'd like us to kind of support you, we can either help at the author level or, just have a few meetings and kind of get you started. So if you are interested in having us help you with your systematic review, we have a form available here for you to fill out. And one more important thing is Covidence. Covidence is, we have a video describing it here, but it is an amazing systematic review software that I have open here that basically facilitates that whole screening process that I described. So I'm sure when I was saying, you need 2 reviewers to independently screen all the titles and abstracts, you were like, well, how do you do that? Like, how do they find them all? How do you know who said yes to what? Covidence basically facilitates that whole thing where you go in and you import your references from the databases. And again, like I said, we have this instructional video, and this is something we're happy to help you with, but you import your references from the databases. It deduplicates. So, let's say you found the same article in two databases, you don't have to review it twice in here. And then you go in and you screen your results. And so it takes you through that whole process, and it keeps track of everything so that it creates your Prisma flow diagram for you. So that is an extremely useful tool that we make available for you guys that I absolutely love and am happy to help anyone with. And I'm happy to take any questions at this time.